Hi there, it's Mike Bird, and I'm doing a special video for subscribers to my Substack page. And this time we're looking at the book of Romans. Now, big things happen when you study Romans in depth. Think about what happened when Augustine chanced upon Romans 13:11 to 14, or when Karl Barth picks it up in the aftermath of the First World War, or when Luther, started reading and meditating, and he realized the righteousness of God was not the righteousness whereby God condemns him, but the divine righteousness that acquits him. Big things happen when people read and study Romans. So I asked our loyal coterie of subscribers, what questions they would like to have me answer on Romans, and I'm glad to say I've got them. But first of all, interesting bit of trivia. My favorite verse in Romans is Romans 4:25, which says, "He was handed over for our sins and raised for our justification." In fact, I wrote my honors thesis on that single verse, looking at the relationship between justification and resurrection in Pauline theology. Quite a fascinating topic. But let's get into some of these questions, and there are some good ones. These are good questions. First of all, question from John. What do you make of Scott McKnight's reading Romans backward? I found this really helpful and helps me picture Romans as being about reconciliation and then include salvation. I think Scott's onto a good thing here, because when people read Romans, they come with an agenda, like, I want to read about the Roman road to salvation. I'm looking for some good reformed proof texts, that type of a thing. And they read chapters 1 through to about 8, and then their interest can peter off. Now, if they're a Calvinist or an Arminian, they might debate about chapter 9. Then chapter 11 is important if you're, maybe a dispensationalist and want to know about the end times. Then you get the first two verses of chapter 12, a bit of ethics, but after that, people's interest pretty much peters out. And yet, in that last third of Romans, you've got some very important stuff. Actually, that last quarter of Romans, I should say, you've got some important stuff. You've got a lot on Paul's view of ethics that seems to splice together a lot of scriptural themes, but it can also be a little bit congruent with or cohere with a little bit of stoicism in some ways, just a little bit. Paul gives various sort of ethical tweets about, not seeking revenge, and you should be known for loving the community. Then chapter 13 is all about, the church and its relationship to the civil powers, and then a bit of eschatology and ethics at the end of chapter 13. And chapters 14 and a half and 15 are where Paul is basically trying to explain the basis of unity when you have divided congregations divided on how much law we should be having in our lives, in our fellowship, in our churches, maybe ethnic divisions as well, although that's not necessarily absolute, because Paul wants the Roman churches to support him, and he doesn't want them supporting him, or he knows they can't support him if they're just a potentially fragmented cluster of house churches with a bit of mutual suspicion over each other. Okay, he doesn't want the churches to divide over what I would call halakhic lines. Halakha is about how you interpret the law. He doesn't want that to be the dividing point. He wants to remind them that as the Messiah received them, so they should receive one another. And of course, second half of chapter 15 is all about Paul's mission, his priestly service for proclaiming the gospel. Chapter 16, he commends the letter carrier Phoebe, greets all these various people he knows in Rome, and has some then final, somewhat miscellaneous exhortations. Now, if you read the first half in light of the second half, which is what I think Scott wants us to do, I do think it makes a lot more sense, because you've got to understand the exhortations he makes to the congregations, the type of unity he wants them to have. And then if you retrospectively go back and read Romans, so it does make sense. I mean, for a long time, I thought about writing a little mini commentary just on Romans 14 to 15, kind of like a manual for church reconciliation, but I wanted to do that with specific attention to its theological foundation and the rest of the letter. I would go so far as to say I think Scott's basically done that. So if you haven't read Scott's little book, Reading Romans Backwards, I think it really is very helpful. I tend to recommend it as a good book review task for students in Romans exegesis courses. Another question from Christy. How would you spend 15 minutes with a person who believes the Roman road to salvation is simple? My team wins and I get more people on it as my mandate to help them see the richness of Romans. Yeah, I mean, I forget who it was, but someone said the Roman road is not really a road. It's kind of like you've randomly taken bricks out of a building and then kind of like made a road out of it. Now, look, there's some people who came to faith through the Roman road, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But again, it's the propensity is to teach the book of Romans as if everything is answering the question, what must I do to be saved? We always assume that's the question behind everything. When you read Matthew, when you read Hebrews, when you read John, that's it. I think Paul is dealing with some more sophisticated and even some different questions, like who are God's people and how do you tell? I think that, how much newness is there in the new covenant? How much continuity is there with the people of Israel and Israel's sacred traditions, what we call the Old Testament? He's dealing with a lot of those things. How do you be a Christ believer, knowing that most Jews have rejected the Messiah and still believe that, and do that in a pagan context in the very epicenter of imperial power and religion and society down in Rome? How do you do that? I think Paul is dealing with a wider array of questions. Now, it does include a person's individual salvation. I mean, I think that comes to a bit of a climax, particularly in chapter 5. God demonstrates his own love for us, and this why we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. I'm not rejecting or eschewing or kind of looking down on the individual side of salvation, but that's one part of a much bigger panoramic picture about God's people, the sending of Christ, the sending of the Spirit. The Spirit is very big as well. How you relate to the unbelieving Jewish world, how to be a Christian in a pagan context. What are the type of fellowship we should have? What should we think of the law? And what does it really mean to believe that God's power and glory are revealed in Jesus Christ? So the Roman road is not so much incorrect for what it explicitly says, but it's how it kind of rips it out of that wider meta narrative and that wider series of exhortation and arguments that Paul makes, and kind of constructs this own little argument, which is kind of relevant to Romans, but certainly not the main deal. It's kind of like, to give an example, the Romans road, I would describe it, it's kind of like pulling down a grand cathedral and building a wedding chapel in Las Vegas. Okay, now weddings are good. You can do weddings in both the cathedral and a wedding chapel, but definitely I'd go with the cathedral, because Romans is more of a cathedral. It's not a kind of drive-through wedding thing or drive through and get your salvation thing. So thank you for that question, Christy. Noah says or asks, does Paul have physical Jews in mind in Romans 11:26? Does it speak of a future salvation of Jews en masse or the church in general? Well, let me read out Romans 11:26 for those who may not know it. There Paul says, beginning in verse 25, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Okay, now, some people argue that the Israel here, both in verse 25 and in verse 26, is what you might call empirical or ethnic Israel. Therefore, it's talking about the Jewish people in whole or maybe in part in some kind of future age where they're all saved, redeemed when the Messiah returns. Others say, no, Romans 11:26, it's a little bit more like Galatians 6:16, when Paul talks about the Israel of God. It's more of a spiritual entity. Now, there is some ground for this. Like in chapter 9, Paul seems to divide Jews into two categories, the Israel according to the flesh and the Israel according to the promise. So those who are, who are ethnically or biologically descended from Abraham, that do not necessarily belong to Abraham, he says, because he plots a kind of division in Israel's history between sons of the flesh and sons of the promise, that type of a thing. And some people want to say when Paul gets to Romans 11:26, he's doing a similar thing. He's saying, this unified church of Jews and Gentiles, that is the Israel who's going to be saved in the future. And this is where I will probably disagree from my co-author and friend, N.T. Wright. He takes Romans 11:26 in the more spiritual sense. Spiritual may not be the right word there, but a sense in which it includes all of Israel conceived as Jews and Gentiles believing in Christ. The problem is Paul consistently, I think across, except for maybe Romans 9, but fairly consistently in chapters 9 and 11, refers to Israel as empirical or ethnic Israel. So I really do think it is, like I said, ethnic Israel, particularly in verse 25. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full numbers of Gentiles come in. I mean, you wouldn't say the church has experienced a full type of hardening or anything like that. So I think he's definitely referring to ethnic Israel quite consistently. Interesting observation I'll make. Although Paul can certainly rally against Jews and Judaism in various ways and in various degrees, for Paul, the title Israel is always positive. Okay, Israel is always a positive thing, and it seems to represent the very best of the Jewish people's religion, heritage, and history. So that's where I stand on the Romans 11:26. Joshua, he says, if we were not to have Romans, what would we lose? Does the fact that Paul hasn't gone to Rome change how we should read the epistle? Is this the closest thing to Paul's systematic theology textbook? Oh, wow, that's a good question. Yeah, for a long time, people have argued that it was a kind of, Romans is a kind of miniature systematic theology. And in fact, Doug Campbell comes fairly close to arguing that is kind of what Paul is doing, providing a bit of a, maybe not systematic, but a type of apocalyptic theology. If it is a systematic theology, I don't think it's done well. It doesn't have much on the Holy Spirit, or at least not a specific section. There's so many areas that would be missing. It's not what you would expect. It's not even a commentary on the Apostles' Creed. Like all of Paul's letters, it's a situational letter. And the main situation is Paul wants to go to Rome on his way to Spain, and he wants the Roman churches there to support him. Now, he also knows in order for them to support him, they've got to be convinced that he's, on the side of the right. He's a good Christian leader. So he's got to assuage any concerns he has, or people who are trying to co-opt him to some bad things. Okay. So for example, Paul may have a reputation for being anti-law or anti-Israel, or maybe people want to appeal to Paul to magnify their own views of a negative perspective on the law. And Paul kind of sets out his apostolic credentials. He talks about his gospel that he sets forth at length, at theological depth. He talks particularly, what he thinks about the law is not a bad thing that's been done away with, but a good thing that's been fulfilled. The letter begins and ends with his missionary plans. I would say the closest analogy that we have for Paul's letter is not a systematic theology. I'd call it more of a missionary fundraising letter, to be perfectly honest. I think that's the closest analogy we have to what Paul is doing in Romans. This is missional theology. He's setting forth what he's going to do in the mission, what he thinks of the law, what he thinks of Israel. He wants a church that's unified around Christ, not divided over how much of the law they have. Certain things you can allow to conscience, and certain things, differences you can live with. So no, I don't think it's a systematic theology. Okay, another question from Kayla. It's got 3 parts. What do you wish more people knew about the book of Romans before teaching it? Oh boy. Number one thing I wish they knew is that it had 16 chapters, not 8. There was one scholar, I can't remember his name, but he said he went to seminary or graduate school and he took 3 courses on Romans. Every single one of them finished at the end of chapter 8. So many people get to chapter 8 of Romans and just stop. Now, I've got the dilemma as a seminary professor because, we've got to teach Greek exegesis of Romans, and it's hard to do 16 chapters of exegesis through some of the most sublime and complex argumentation you can find. So what I tend to do as a seminary professor is we do exegete chapters 1 to 8 largely, but I then base all of the assessments on the second half of it. So I take them through the first half and then kind of leave them to a sort of, choose your own adventure in the second half. So I make sure all the essays that they do about stuff that appears in the second half of the letter, that way they're getting an adequate balance out of it. And I try to do a little bit of writing on that too. But that's, like I said, that's why Scott McKnight's book is so important, because he kind of starts with the end as the best way to understand the first half. He says, what's your favorite commentary on Romans, other than yours, of course? Well, obviously. Well, look, to plug my commentary, look, it's not a technical, the most erudite one, but I do think it is a good one for preachers. A lot of the preaching commentaries on Romans I read, their application was basically theology, because of this believe that. And writing application for all of Romans was hard. One of the hardest things I've had to do in writing and biblical studies. But I've tried to produce an exegetically rigorous Romans commentary that is good for preachers. But beyond that, what are the best commentaries on Romans out there? Hard to go past Douglas Moo on Romans in the NIC-NT. I think it is hard to go past that one. Particularly the second edition, where I think he's sort of improved things. He's kind of softened a little bit in his sort of new perspective critique. Tom Schreiner's isn't too bad either, although the problem with Tom Schreiner is I much prefer all the decisions he made in his first edition. So I do like Tom Schreiner's view, but I much prefer the first edition to the second edition. And because he kind of changes how he treats the righteousness of God. I think he changes how he understands the wretched man in Romans 7. So Tom Schreiner is definitely up there as well. Beverly Gaventa's got a good little book on When in Rome. A. Catherine Greaves got a good little book too on the story of Romans that I wouldn't neglect. For those who like the apocalyptic Paul, Leander Kecker's got a short but quite readable and cogent. I mean, he squeezes a lot of detail into a very short book. I think Richard Hayes uses that as the commentary in his courses. N.T. Wright's stuff in the New Interpreter's Bible, that is pretty good too. I think you see some real vintage Tom in there, some of his best work. Part of me had hoped that one day Tom would do the ICC commentary on Romans. I mean, that would be fantastic, particularly because he helped proofread the 1970s edition by C.E.B. Cranfield. I'd love to see that, but it's probably very, very probably not going to happen. What else do I like on Romans? Craig Kendis is pretty good. Again, very short, concise, but very helpful. So, there's it's almost like every New Testament exegete wants to do a Romans commentary. So it's pretty hard. But those off the top of the cuff, those would be my favorite ones. And what is significant about the women listed in Romans 16? Well, I think Nijay Gupta and I did a whole video about this. I think we covered this in one of our videos. I think it shows the prominence of women in the Pauline circle. You've got Phoebe, who's a deacon in the Church of Cenchrea, Paul's benefactor. She's the letter carrier. And I don't think she went around reading the letter. I don't necessarily think she got up and immediately started preaching from it. But it was her job to see that the contents of the letter were put into effect. That's largely what letter carriers did in antiquity. I mean, Peter Head's written on that. It's very good stuff. But if they had any questions about the letter, like, what's the righteousness of God? Who's the wretched man? That type of thing. She was probably the one who answered them. So first person to exposit Romans was probably a woman. And then there's other women mentioned as well. You've got Prisca, who's there with Aquila. You've got Junia, not Junius, Junia and Andronicus, who are outstanding among the apostles. Mary, who was a co-worker, just like Timothy or Titus is a co-worker. So it shows that women are very prominent, and Paul doesn't differentiate roles or gifts according to pink and blue spiritual gifts. Interesting fact. So thank you for that questions, Kayla. Anthony's got a question here. It's like, and this is a doozy. What is the proper interpretation of Romans 7:13-25? How would you pastor a true Christian struggling with addiction or some besetting sin with this passage? Okay, there's two questions there. Romans 7:13-25. A lot of people want to say that's Paul talking about the Christian life, the struggle with sin against the flesh. people take a lot of solace from that, a lot of comfort from that. Like even Paul, writing his I, had that kind of that struggle himself. And like, well, if Paul struggled with sin, then it's okay if we do, and we're honest about it. No, I just don't think that's what. I don't think that's what Paul is doing. Romans 7, you got to remember, is largely a defense of the law. Okay, Paul is trying to explain what he thinks the law is doing. And for me, what I think is really crucial is you've got to look at Romans 7 verses 5 to 6. Now, Romans 7 verse 5 says, "For when we were controlled by the sinful nature, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit to death." I think 7:5 is the summary of pretty much the rest of chapter 7. About being controlled by the sinful nature, the law only brought death, it didn't bring deliverance. And then if you look at 7:6, but now by dying to what bounds us, but now by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code. That, I think, is the summary of Romans 8. So I think 7:5 and 7:6 are kind of like a table of contents about what is to come next. And the struggle with sin that Paul is presenting in chapters 7 to 25, particularly from verse 13 and onwards, is not the struggle of the Christian, okay? Because this person is under the law, where Paul says in chapter 6, we're no longer under law, we're under grace, okay? We're not a slave to sin in Romans 6, and the man in Romans 7 is a slave to sin. So the guy in Romans 7, I think, needs Jesus, which is kind of the conclusion he comes to at the end, that he needs to be redeemed, and then gives thanks that there is a redeemer. So I think chapter 7 is referring to the life of a person, either a Jew or maybe a God-fearer, under the law, as they see it now from the perspective of faith, what Karl Barth called the horrifying view backwards. And he uses the analogy, you're out in Switzerland, you need to go around a big bend in a road, and you decide you'll walk, rather than walk all the way around the bend, you'll just cut through the forest, and you go along, and then you realized it's early spring, and you just walked across a frozen lake, okay? But you didn't know because it's all covered in the snow. It's like you look back and think, oh, wow, that was crazy. That was dangerous. That could have gone very badly. It's that horrifying view backwards. About dealing with addiction or some besetting sin. I'll be honest with you, this is not the text I would use for that. Addiction and the pastoral care of is very complex. I've had relatives who have struggled with various types of addiction, and oh boy, it is hard. It's hard. It's a real tearjerker, because there's so many steps forward and steps back, and you really can feel let down and betrayed. Then a great release, I guess, when people do recover and get their lives back together. I don't know about like giving them verses. I think there's a lot of encouragement in the Bible and the New Testament about I think Romans 5 has got a fair bit about not being, or Romans 6 about not being slave to things. Okay, being slaves to what you desire, not being a slave to sin. I mean, that's probably where I would go, Romans 6. But yeah, pastoral care for people with addiction is difficult. People think, well, if I just explain to this person that their addiction is wrong and it's having bad consequences, then they'll know, and then they'll give up. That doesn't work, because people with addictions know it's wrong. They know it's harmful. They hate themselves for what they do and what they do to others, but they just cannot break the habit. So simply reminding them of how sinful they are doesn't always work, because they know how sinful they are. They know how broken they are. And they really, they go from, they've got to get this fix on alcohol, meth, drugs, gambling, or whatever it is. And then once they've got it, they're then racked with guilt and pain and all sorts of things. So yeah, I'd be a little bit more careful about applying verses just to people with addiction. It's maybe a slightly more wider view of pastoral care comes into fashion. But Anthony, I understand what you're getting at, how this sort of thing can indeed be helpful. Well, that's probably everything I've got to say about your questions from Romans. Thanks for those questions. I think they were very good. They certainly made me get into the letter, and hopefully you've enjoyed the explanation that I've been able to give about what is going on in Romans. So yeah, that concludes our Q&A video for this month. I'll have a think about what we should do next month. Maybe you could leave a comment below what topics you would like me to cover, and I can pick one. I mean, I thought about maybe doing one on complementarianism or egalitarianism. Maybe we could do something more specific by like Romans 9 to 11, or I think me and Nijay might be doing that in the future. But if you've got a topic you'd like me to cover in one of the Q&As, please let me know and I'll see what I can do. Otherwise, the Lord bless you and keep you all, and I'll probably see you around Substack, email, Twitter, or Facebook, or wherever it is we know each other. Take care and God bless.